This is a session on breakthroughs in measuring well-being and how that's going to affect the wider economy. Some of this will be a bit simple, but forgive me if I'm saying things that you've heard before, but I think it's always helpful to just go back to fundamentals. And fundamentally, you know this, what gets measured gets done. What we measure is really important. Another way it was phrased, you measure what you treasure what you measure, you know. So this is important. And of course, as we know, we're in a mess. I said this in the plenary. We've got an economy at the minute that is unsustainable, unfair, unstable, and is making us unhappy. And just one figure. There's probably about 400 people or so in this conference, a bit over actually. The 400 richest Americans now have the same wealth as, wait for it, the bottom 155 million. 400 to 155 million. That's not trickle-down economics anymore. It's suck up or hoover up. You know, we're in a different world. So you know the things about unsustainable, you know how unstable our economy is, and you know that well-being has been actually declining in the US. So, you know, we're in a pretty good pickle. That's the macroeconomy. And how we measure that macroeconomy is that famous thing, GDP. And you all know this, what Robert Kennedy said way back in his presidential bid in '68, in that early stage. He said, it measures everything except those things that really make life worthwhile, like our love for our children, our forests, etc. It measures, you know, if we smoke more, GDP goes up. If we have to be treated for cancer, GDP goes up. If we cut the forest down, GDP goes up. If we have more car crashes, GDP goes up. It's crazy. So you know that stuff. And one analogy I use sometimes is, and the OECD has used this as well, is relying on GDP alone is like driving a car only looking at the speedometer. Well, clearly, you need to know, are you overheating? Are you running out of fuel? You know, is the world overheating? Are we running out of fuel? What's happening to the temperature? You know, we need to know those things. You would be crazy to not have to drive a car without a few other things. Similarly, we're driving our planet without looking at those things. But that's only part of the question, though. Because you could be going flat out, you could be even measuring the right things, but you could still be going in totally the wrong direction. So what direction, where we want to get to, is the fundamental question. But not even those instruments tell us. And pretty simply, the goal of a good economy, pretty simply, should be one that achieves high well-being for its people, high social justice, much, much fairer than we've got now, high stability and resilience, and does so within fair ecological limits. And by fair, I mean our fair share of that limited world. That's what we're going for. You know, that's not unreasonable, is it? That's what we should be looking for. Now, that term, well-being, another term I use sometimes, and Neff uses sometimes, is flourishing. And by flourishing or well-being, we mean functioning well and experiencing good feelings day to day and overall. So it's about both functioning and how you're feeling about things. So it's both about your functioning is obviously, you know, some of that is about feelings to psychology, but the functioning is about your resilience, your energy levels, your capacities. So it's both those things. It's both the psychological resources and those things. And those things are both affected both by your own capacities and by the external conditions. Now, in the UK, we have a government slogan for healthy eating. It's called 5 a day, and that's 5 a day of fruit and veg. So, you know, you're supposed to have 5 portions of fruit and veg a day to be healthy. Well, we came up with actually, in a scientific way, with the government, was actually working with on the government scientific agency, on what are the 5 a day for well-being? What are the things you need to do, we all need to do in our lives every day to make us flourish, to have high well-being? And they're very simple. They're pretty obvious, but they're just worth repeating because we just forget them. Connect. How much you connect, how much you, with friends, with neighbors, how much you talk to people. Second one, be active. That's very well known, the endorphins of being active, walking fast, taking part in sports, all those things raised. But take notice, that's not so obvious. How many of you have been outside today and just looked what the weather's doing, what the trees are doing, actually felt where you are, got outside the new economy bubble and actually rooted yourself here in this barred campus? Yeah, great, you have. That take notice, just noticing, being sentient, being in the present, terribly important. Keep learning, very obvious, it's hugely important to our flourishing. And then the last one is blindingly obvious, but so important. That most uneconomic of activity, giving love, giving to friends, giving to strangers, giving to our loved ones. That's so simple to say, but if you think about economics, it doesn't recognize giving. It's not an economic concept even. So, that's pretty foreign. And we did, interestingly, a study also of 1,000 school kids in a Northern English school, looking at particularly girls in lots of different backgrounds, poor, rich, wealthy neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, and looked at which girls were doing best in school and which girls were also having the highest well-being, which are the ones that had both those characteristics. And we thought it would be qualities like your family background, possibly. It might be boyfriends, other girlfriends. Those are all high things because they're part of the Connect. But the biggest one was their involvement in sports, art, and music. Those are team activities that gave them a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, brought connections, kept active, would keep learning. All those things came to play. So those things, this can sound so simple, but it's really important. But what about those macro factors that affect well-being? These are just some of them. But pretty simply, if unemployment goes up, everybody's well-being goes down. Not just, obviously, the people who are unemployed, their well-being goes down most. But the whole country, if you've got high unemployment, everybody feels that. If similarly with high inequality, it's not just the people suffering the inequality, it's obviously much worse for them, miles worse. But it affects the whole country. Instability does, environmental pollution does, social fragmentation does, so does high debt, actually. I should have added that to the list. So those are external factors. So as well as those personal factors I gave you some sense of, those 5 a day, these things also have a massive effect on our well-being. And those are things we could alter by government policy. So some of the things are in our individual control, some of those things are within government control. So how we affect our well-being is something we really can do something about. The breakthrough that we in the New Economics Foundation and lots of other allies with us, Lord Layard, many other people, have made in the UK, is we got the UK government to start measuring well-being as a headline indicator. And basically every new entrant to the civil service is being trained in this. Every department is looking at what policies are going to affect well-being. The top 200 civil servants in the countries and some of their ministers have gone away on a retreat to talk about it. They're taking it seriously. So we're going to measure well-being. And as Cameron said, to all this sounds like a distraction from the serious business of government. I would say that finding out what would really improve lives and acting on it actually is the serious business of government. It's quite a statement for a Prime Minister to make. And we ran an event in Parliament because we act as a secretariat for an all-party group on well-being. And we had Sir Gus O'Donnell, and forgive me, I mentioned this yesterday, but some of you weren't in the plenary. And he came along and said that he thought, he's the head of the civil service, known affectionately by his initials, God. And he came along and said he thought within 10 years, well-being would be the chief measure and GDP would be subsidiary. Now, I think that would be fantastic if that happened. But the fact you got a hard-bitten Scottish, I put the Scottish in because they got this idea of being mean, which is actually very unfair. Hard-bitten Scottish economists saying that well-being will supersede GDP is really interesting, something shifting. So that's been a big step forward, and the first figures are going to be coming out in July this year, so just next month. And then they're going to measure well-being for a very big sample every year and publish it, which is great news. But obviously, just measuring well-being alone isn't going to be the whole question. We've actually got to have 3 main measures. We've got to have a measure of our flourishing. That's probably the most important goal of all. But we've got to know what's happening to the planet, in doing so? Are we conserving and building the planet's resources? Are we stripping them, which we're clearly doing at the minute? And we've got to have measures of economic activity that translate one into the other. And that's what we're working on at the minute, is all those measures, so we can come up with a simple framework that's not too complicated, but actually can show what's really happening to the economy and the ecosystem and to our own well-being. We're about to publish, actually in just over a week's time, a new one of these. I've got to show you the old one because it's under embargo at the minute. But what we did was we looked at, on the left-hand side, how long people live and their well-being. So it's called happy life years. It's one multiplied by the other. So it's a measure of longevity and well-being. And on the bottom is this measure of ecological footprint, which is basically about how much one's consuming of the Earth's resources. And it's done in global hectares. But fundamentally, to cut a long story short, if you're below 2, you're living within planetary means. Now, these are all the countries in the world. What you can see is the sub-Saharan African countries down here, in the purple squares, are living within planetary means, great, but life expectancy is brutally short, and well-being is very low. Miserable short lives for reasons that people know, HIV, AIDS, epidemic, other things, factors. It's getting better, so some of them are going up. Right over here, you've got the USA. It comes on our index at 105 out of all the countries in the world. Not very good performance, is it? It's got quite high well-being, and people are living a long time. But you're consuming 5 Earths. If everybody lived like the US, we'd need 5 planets. So they're living 5 times their capacity. And look who's up here, Costa Rica. The only country that gets near, though they don't quite make it because they're living beyond planetary means, that gets quite near to being where we want to get to, is Costa Rica. People have higher well-being than the US. They actually live as long, and they're doing so on about 1/5 of the resources. And they're doing so because they put huge amounts of money into health and education. They have the Latin verbs, a bit of, some of that might help as well. They have virtually 100% renewable energy. They abolished their army back in '49 so that they could put more resources into, and etc. They're not perfect. There's lots of flaws, but they're the nearest one can get to where one needs to get to. And so when I talked earlier about whether we're going in the right direction, that actually is about up here. You need all the countries in the world to get up here. You need the ones that are poor and low life expectancy and low well-being to move up, but stay this side of the line. And you need these other ones that come back over here. That's what needs to happen. It's a big task. And at the minute, too many of them are going in the wrong direction. The developing countries, like India and China, are wanting to shoot over here, maybe go up, but to consume too much. And then the US and other people, even worse, are going down like that, consuming more and getting less happy. Sorry, you want to ask?
Just super quick, who are the other, do you know who the other 3 outliers are?
Yes, Dubai and one of the other, Qatar, I think, one of the other states. Denmark's, interestingly, quite high because it has a high footprint because it imports so much. So in our new study, it's not changed dramatically. Costa Rica has really come up. Vietnam has come up and is sort of quite close to Costa Rica. So there are some interesting shifts. Vietnam well-being has got a lot better. It may be just that stage of development. But we don't want people to go that way. We want them to come this way. And the whole development model, the whole way we're looking at it is so wrong. So this is why this is so important. And we're about to publish another one. And we're going to have as well a charter that calls on countries, NGOs, all to support a high well-being but sustainable world and how we need to move there. Because this isn't the most accurate measurement tool, but what it tells you is tells the story. It tells the story of what we need to do as peoples on this earth. That's why it's important. when we ask Gus O'Donnell what some of the implications for policy for this, it's just, this is actually from the UK Treasury, what he listed as some of the policies. I thought it was worth putting back up, because I agreed with a lot of this. It's pretty fundamental. You start saying, well, actually, taking sport out of schools, that's stupid. Taking green spaces, cutting music services. A lot of those things that we do to make life more worth living are really important. How we build our environment, how involved people are in various things rather than just having them done to them. All those things affect our well-being hugely. So you can see, that's just a list, it's just to give you an idea. There's a huge amount in there. But what I really want to touch on is, I think, at the beginning I put up those 4 U's. We've got an economy that's just taking us in the wrong direction totally. And if this is going to do anything, it's actually going to start to say, it does 2 things. It says this is the goal. It actually gives you a goal you can measure. And it tells you how well you're getting on the way to getting there. So having the direction and been able to talk to people about that, and people are fascinated by this stuff. Our first Happy Planet Index, the 40-page PDF, was downloaded 1 million times from 180 countries across the world. And we've had governments, we're working with a number of governments now on this whole subject. People really get this because it tells the story of what they want and what lives we want. So I think it has the power to change the central dynamic. I think it will topple our current macroeconomics. So it's a Trojan horse. I'm really surprised the Conservative Prime Minister in the UK has taken this on, because it's a Trojan horse for much of what that party believes in. We fundamentally have to rethink efficiency and productivity. If you remember that graph with all the balls on, the fundamental issue then is how we're using scarce ecological resources to create well-being, good jobs, and public goods for us. That's a very different economy than maximizing the returns to financial capital. We've actually got to maximize returns in the way of well-being, jobs, public goods to ecological capital, which means we cannot carry on running our economy by maximizing returns to financial capital. We can only satisfy us on that. We have to run a very different economy. It will still be a market economy, but it will run to a totally different metric. And this starts to give us a way out of jail, because the jail at the minute is, as I was saying in the plenary, put your foot on the accelerator, we screw the planet up. Put your foot on the brake, we throw more and more people out of jobs. You've got to change the structure, fundamentally, the institutions, the metrics, and this starts to give us a way of doing so, and why we're calling for a great transition of the economy that really changes the structure of the economy fundamentally. I think that's probably all I ought to say at this stage, and hand over to Robert. You can get lots of our publications online, and in 2 weeks you'll get even more of them. And that one, Measuring Our Progress, the Chief Statistician said was the best, the UK Chief Statistician said was the best report she'd ever read on measuring our well-being. So thank you.
Thank you, Stewart. Okay, so I'll put a little bit of a different angle to the same thing, and then speak a little bit about what the process is. So, do you know what this is? Anyone from Chicago? So, do you know what it is? So, you have never been to the Moto restaurant, which is the chef is a guy called Homero Cantu, and this is one of his creations. When you look at this is what a guy called Daniel Kahneman, who is a famous, actually, Nobel Prize winner, psychologist, economist, would say, what you see is all there is. So, what is this? This is actually a Cuban sandwich. So, that's kind of the same thing with growth and well-being. So, if you look at one graph, yellow is growth. You look at the graph and see that everything is all right. We're growing, and we're more happy because in the past 20-odd years, almost all countries, I think all countries have grown considerably, China the most. So if you look at this, then what you see is all there is. However, if you look at what Stewart has mentioned, the satisfaction with life, you see that while there is a strong growth in real GDP per capita, you see that life satisfaction is flat over the same period of time. This is called the Easterlin Paradox. So,
The what paradox?
Easterlin Paradox is a scholar who wrote about this in '74. So, to put a little bit of a different angle to what Stewart said, if you look at this graph, which on one side you see the best fit, so GDP per capita, and then you see on the left side you see the subjective well-being of countries. You see the trend line, and to show a little bit different picture about Hungary, Hungary is that little country down here, so it kind of diverges from the trend line. It's living much better than people do feel how they live. When they're asked, how do you feel today, this is what Stewart was referring to as a subjective well-being indicator. You see Hungary back there. So whereas Hungary is, from a GDP point of view, it's a little country in the EU, from a GDP point of view, a little bit below average of OECD countries. When asked about subjective well-being, we're quite back in the line. And this is NEF's last Happy Planet Index, which confirms the same thing. Hungary is in fifth from the last. So whereas Hungary is on average quite well off, it's, I think, the 51st most rich country in the world, which is, you know, Hungarians don't feel it, but it's still the 51st. From a subjective well-being point, we are second to the last, same as China, which is not very good. So Stewart was happy to have a prime minister who speaks about subjective well-being. We don't. So what can we do? And we have been speaking about what we can do together. So five things that many people say in this conference needs to be done. One, I think, is important. You have to go international or global. NEF's work, very important in the last 7 years, has been concentrated on the UK. So you see what the breakthrough they get concentrating on one country, where we have to make a leap forward. And I think that NEI has also concentrated on the US, but we need to do the whole thing more global. We have to get more powerful. There are a lot of think tanks, there are lots of NGOs here. There are very limited number of people from the media, and there are no politicians. I know that this may sound good, but it's not. Because in the end of the day, they're the ones who make change. And we can wait until we become politicians, but that'll take a long time. So I think that we must have politicians here, invite them, and become one of us. And then change will happen. We have to be global, that is, we have to be global and local at the same time. We have to be networked, and we have to be unified. So, in order to do this, 4 think tanks got together and formed what we call the Budapest Coalition, because we formed it in a restaurant in downtown Budapest. So what's being done? 4 think tanks, NEF, NEF Budapest, the New Economics Forum from Budapest, Fabrique Spinoza from Paris, France, and the University of Siena from Italy, got together and formed a coalition to make all this happen on a European scale. What we're doing right now is we're mapping institutions in the EU who have ever dealt with subjective well-being or any other well-being measurement and research. We want to have one institution in every member state and do a network and place it on the agenda of decision makers. So what we want to do is we want to jointly develop a headline indicator, as Stewart has mentioned, and also together with the institutions all over Europe, we want to develop a policy agenda, and we thought a very long time for how long should it be. And we said 10 years is too much, 2 years is too little. So we came up with 2018, which is 5 years from next year when we want to start the work. And that seems to be a perspective that politicians would understand, because it's just a little bit longer than their election cycles. This process is supported by an institution called the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is a big foundation all over Europe. Actually, it's funded by the German left. The first thing that we'll do after mapping, we will have a meeting of these think tanks in Budapest in October. The goal is, on that meeting, to have a roadmap for this policy plan. And then the next thing will be, once we have a roadmap and we start working on this, is kind of initiate, and this is only a working title as of now, a Davos 2.0. Basically inviting policymakers, politicians, innovators, business leaders, and other kind of opinion leaders to first understand and then take the message. And you know, Davos took about 20 odd years to become Davos, not the city but the event. So we have a long way to go. And yesterday, I think Bob Massey said that people who spoke about women being electable took 75 years. They didn't live to see. I hope that we'll be more lucky than that in both Davos 2.0 and well-being as a more important indicator than GDP will become the tool of politicians within our lifetime. Thank you very much.
If you take life expectancy and gross domestic product, run the two,
Yep.
you'll see that life expectancy can be greatly improved with an increase in GDP of only $2,000 per capita. It is cheap to improve the well-being of people. We don't have to go to that extreme, like in the United States, where we're investing awful amount and getting very little.
Yeah. I totally agree, because I think the important thing about that Easterlin Paradox that Robert put up is, of course, people's well-being increases and their life expectancy increases if you're very poor. It's fundamental. You've got to have your basic needs met. You know, that is so obvious. And you know, if actually we could do two things on this planet, in my view, one would be to stop the richest of us consuming so much, and the other would be, for moral, for practical, for climate change reasons, really investing in the poorest people on this planet. We're terribly culpable. We're not doing that at anything like this. We're, you know, whether you talk about 0.7 of GDP as an aid, you know, which my government does, or US is probably about 0.3 of GDP, 0.3, and it's peanuts. We're not, you know, we could, just as you say, just a very small increase of the poorest people would do massive amounts for life expectancy, for well-being, and for actually also fertility, even though no one says that, because actually women's empowerment, women's jobs, has a massive impact on how many kids people have. So if we're concerned about the population on this planet, let's, whatever your moral stance, which I think the moral reason is the strongest, let's invest in the poorest people. But we did a study, when we did that 1 million people downloaded our Happy Planet Index the first time, we did a study that looked at people's well-being and how many planets worth they were living at. So we had a crude measure in questionnaires of what level they were living at. There was no difference at all between the well-being of the people living at one planet's level, i.e. in harmony with nature. It was actually slightly higher than the people living at 10 planets level. We had both in that survey of 40,000 people. No difference at all. So people's well-being, we can be very happy. We can live a long time and live at one planet's worth of things. It's perfectly feasible, even with 9 billion people. It's not, we've got all the resources to do it. We're just messing it up terribly. I was about to use French words, but I won't.
There are two other, I don't want to look like a statistician, but there are two other very important indexes, and one is what's called the Gini index, and that measures the level of equality in a society, and that shows a lot, and there is a correlation. The smaller the Gini index is, the bigger the life satisfaction or subjective well-being is. So that's kind of an argument for a more equal society. And the other one is, what's interesting is the Plenty Index, which is an index that measures what is the upper level of personal wealth which does not drive more subjective well-being.
Yeah.
So from when on, there is no growth in subjective well-being, even if you have more money. And obviously that is an argument for taxation, top-level taxation, which is gaining ground both in France by the new president, François Hollande, or even Warren Buffett has suggested to President Obama in this country that you need to tax the rich higher.
Please, yeah.
This whole idea of social capital, I feel kind of instinctively that there is such a thing as social capital, and that when we have big social capital, we function better. And I'm thinking about trust and efficiency, and the question I have for you is there something in your measurements that can measure and help define that collaboration, that sense of community, that especially trust? I think trust is a big number.
Yes, I mean, definitely. When we did that European index that Robert mentioned, we looked at a range of indicators by a huge questionnaire. We inserted 60 questions in the European Social Survey, which is covers 36,000 people over 22 nations. So it's a big sample and statistically accurate, useful. And we looked at people's life satisfaction, their flourishing, their energy levels, their capacities, but we also looked at social issues. And we looked at particularly trust, and we looked at a couple of other social measures. And while the UK can seem to do well on some indicators, this was 2 or 3 or 4 years back, we found in that survey, out of the 22 countries, and the UK was the lowest out of those 22 European countries for trust of young people in each other and in the institutions of the country. And then we're surprised 2 years later that we have riots. These things, they're there, and there's reasons for them. And this data can tell you some of those stories and enable you to do something about it if you're wise. And so that, as I was mentioning about those school children, how much we set up and support through policy issues where people feel valued and valuable. That they're valuable members of society, they feel valued by others, they feel they've got a role. It's as simple as that in some ways. It's about their connections with other people and how valuable they feel they are and how valued by the society they're in they feel they are. And that says everything, as well as the trust levels, and you can measure those things. So yes, it does speak to that very directly.
Are there any ways where we've been able to measure that in the past versus over time?
Yes, no, it's a good question. The time series data is not brilliant on this yet.
Yeah.
I mean, on wider well-being it is, and we're just in this latest survey we've done an inequality of well-being, because obviously you've got to look, just as you do on environmental footprint or income or on well-being, you've got to look at the distribution of that. And if averages are imperfect for that reason.
No.
So you've got to understand, so as you would understand. So we need much better time series data. We're starting to get it, but it's still relatively early days. This is a new science. I ought to pick up a couple of other questions, forgive me.
So the GPI uses, obviously, putting a value, a monetary value on non-market commodities for that nature, social, and all these things, which is what we did in Maryland. We did the GPI. I'm just kind of curious in Europe, is that fraught with peril, that whole putting a value on social and environmental? We were kind of cornered. We didn't have exactly what you just said. We don't have long-term polls. We couldn't go to Hopkins or University of Maryland to do the annual well-being polling data. So we did the GPI because we had the data. But I was just kind of, just in general.
I mean, there's several different ways of doing it. That, you know, I was showing you there on our Happy Planet Index an ecological footprint measure, which has the great benefit of looking at the imported. You know, the reason the Danes have got high ecological footprint isn't because they're not doing good environmental policies. They are, but they're importing per capita a lot of stuff from China and other things, which has very large embodied footprint and use of the planet's resources. I think when you get to the valuation, and Robert, you may want to say something on this, I think it's a very good thing to be able to put values on things. One knows that that's very imperfect. Where I get very worried, though, is when one starts trading things, marketizing that. Because once you start trading ecosystems, you know, and putting futures on the Mississippi Basin and all sorts of stuff like that, I think it's crazy. And it's very dangerous because, you know, who's the value for, who's getting the benefit of it. It's useful to be able to talk in the round about how much we value things, and people take notice when you put pound signs to things or dollar signs to things, but let's trade them. Let's trade those things that are precious. They're precious, they're not for trading. So I think that's the issue.
I also think that there's a difference between putting a value and to monetize things, and putting a value can be meaningful, and obviously there are many headline indicators and there are many debates going around how to measure things, and some can be monetized, some can be put a value to, but some simply need to be measured. And when we speak about subjective well-being, one way to measure subjective well-being is to ask people how they feel every day or every minute, but we also know there is an index called the misery index. What makes people worse? And one of the things that makes people feel bad is commute. So there are time tracking objective data about the level or the number of minutes or hours, how much commute there is, and then you have a timeline, and you can see whether there is more commute. So then you can see that people feel worse, or there is less commute, and then people feel better. So to make objective measurement does not necessarily mean that you have to put a value to things or monetize things.
I'm just wondering, I work with a small community agency, and so we tend to use our community sort of as a lab of some sort. What I'm trying to figure is how can I adapt some of those tools that we use to measure well-being to see what impact we're having on the community. How are we improving the well-being of the community by studying all these projects and stuff? So is there metrics?
Yes, there are. And some of the same techniques can be used, but we're just starting to do that work with some communities in the UK. And you know, when we're talking, you know, many of these things like the Evergreen Project and the Oberlin Project, it'd be very interesting to have measures, benchmark measures before and after some of those bits of work to see what's happened to people's well-being as well as various material measures. So there are tools we can use, but it tends not to be done systematically. It needs to be, because that story is such an important one to attract policymakers and actually say, look, this is the difference that's been made. Not just these physical things, terribly important, but this is how people's well-being has gone up. So I think your question's terribly important, and that's starting to be developed. There are a range of tools on that.
Instruments, how would one find out what instruments you're using?
Yeah, I mean, we can get those for you, Edgar, because we're just testing them at the minute. So the community ones, I mean, the other thing we've just launched in the UK is a wellbeing at work tool, which is much more than it really starts to show how people are committed to the goals of their organization, what satisfaction they're getting, how they're managed, and it actually starts to tell a very powerful story about which organizations are flourishing, whether in the private or public sector, and which ones aren't, and what causes that. So we've just done it on ourselves. That we have launched. So we're looking at tools for organizations, for communities, and for nations. I mean, we need each of those levels, and some in between. Robert?
Two sentences. I think you have mentioned that you can work for the best tool ever, or you can just start working with a tool, which might not be perfect, but it's a tool, and I think that's the work we're doing. That yes, we have the principles ready, and there are all different tools for regional, national, local, community level. We have to start, make it going, and then we can improve and improve and improve. And the same happened with GDP. It took about 50 years to become the accepted, big, overarching measurement tool, for the better or the worse.
Yeah. Sadly, we've got to break up. Just one little thing. We're launching this new Happy Planet Index on the 14th of the month. This is just a pre-copy. I can't give that to people. Watch out for it, because it's quite interesting. It goes into these stories in a lot more depth. And Robert, I can just tell you that Hungary is one place above the United States in the Happy Planet Index. So, thank you very much, everybody.